The story begins with the moment the world realized something was changing around Diddy, something that was not just about rumors or gossip anymore, but about a fall from power that nobody thought they would see in real time. The noise around him had been growing for years, with people whispering about strange parties, odd behavior, and many hurt people who no longer wanted to stay silent, but everything shifted the day Cassie filed her lawsuit. That was the day everything cracked open. And that was also the moment 50 Cent says he knew that the world needed a full picture, not pieces scattered across social media. The documentary on Netflix, produced by him, became the space where all of those pieces came together. It was not about jokes or trolling, and it was not about revenge. It was about telling a story that had been growing for decades, a story many believed would stay protected forever, but 50 Cent decided it would not stay in the dark anymore. The documentary shows how the accusations around Cassie did not stay contained the way many expected. Even though the lawsuit was settled within a day, the damage had already been done. Once the details became public, the door opened, and people who had been silent for years suddenly found the courage to speak. And when they did, the stories they shared shook the entertainment world. Former partners, staff, dancers, friends, and people who had been close to Diddy all spoke about moments they said were dark, controlling, and frightening. And through all of it, 50 Cent watched how the truth was coming out piece by piece. That is why he says he felt the need to create something that was not based on gossip, not built on jokes, but made from real footage, real documents, and real people talking about what they lived through. When Diddy was arrested in September 2024, the world saw something they had never seen before. A man who built an empire, who walked around with confidence and control, suddenly looked tired, confused, and paranoid. The footage shown in the documentary, filmed by Diddy himself, showed a man who felt the walls closing in. He walked around hotel rooms, looking out windows as if he was being watched, asking for help from people who worked in media and propaganda, asking for someone who could save him. The documentary shows how he hired a videographer to record his days because he wanted evidence of what he believed was unfair treatment. But instead, what the footage captured was a man losing his grip on the world he built. 50 Cent says this footage alone could have been his own documentary because it showed a side of Diddy the world had never seen. Not the businessman, not the party legend, not the music mogul, but a man who looked like he knew everything was falling apart. He hugged fans with a smile, then got into a car and asked for sanitizer because he did not want their hands on him. He showed love in public, but expressed disgust in private. He looked like someone living two different lives at the same time. The documentary then goes back to the moment many believe changed Diddy's life forever, the 1991 City College tragedy. Thousands of people pushed into a building that could not hold them, and the pressure and confusion led to 9 deaths and many injuries. This was the first major event Diddy ever promoted. He was young, ambitious, and trying to make a name for himself. The tragedy brought him national attention, but instead of hiding, he used that moment to build Bad Boy Entertainment. According to the documentary, he made sure the company was under different names so he would not be held responsible if people sued. That moment, the documentary suggests, was where his pattern of stepping around accountability began. From there, the story moves to the feud that shaped hip-hop culture forever. Tupac and Biggie, the East Coast and the West Coast, the Crips and the Bloods. The documentary features interviews with people who say Diddy played a bigger role in those tensions than the public knew. It includes claims from Keith D, who said Diddy offered $1 million for Tupac and Suge Knight. Diddy has always denied this, but the documentary includes the story because it has been part of the hip-hop world for decades. It is not presented as a final truth, but as part of the larger picture. The documentary also dives into Diddy's relationship with Biggie, one of the most emotional parts of the story. Biggie was loved everywhere, and his talent was clear to everyone around him. But the documentary shows how some people felt that Diddy wanted total control over Biggie's career. Interviews mention how Biggie wanted to leave LA before he was killed, but the trip was canceled. Many people believed that if he had left, he might still be alive. The documentary also reveals that Biggie's funeral was listed as a recoupable expense, meaning the cost was charged back to Biggie's estate, not paid out of Diddy's pocket. For fans, this detail was painful, and it added another layer to the complicated relationship between the two.
The Netflix series then brings viewers into the trial era. It shows testimonies from people who worked for Diddy. One of the most talked about testimonies comes from Capricorn Clark, who said Diddy threatened her life and kidnapped Cassie after finding out she was dating Kid Cudi. The documentary includes jurors explaining why they found her testimony confusing, even though they found it emotional. The jurors also talk about Cassie's story in detail, explaining why they could not convict Diddy on certain charges. They said they believed the relationship looked unhealthy, even disturbing, but that the law required specific evidence of force that they felt was not proven clearly enough. They described Cassie as someone emotionally trapped, not physically forced, and said that made the case harder legally. One of the scenes that shocked viewers was Diddy talking on camera about depositing $200 million. The documentary suggests this happened right before his arrest and that he was moving money because he knew federal charges were coming. He said it calmly, but viewers were stunned by how open he was about moving that much money that quickly. Another intense part of the documentary focuses on the freak-off culture. A male partner named Clayton Howard describes how everything was staged, directed, controlled, and monitored. He speaks about how every detail was chosen by Diddy, down to the lighting and the baby oil. For many, this was one of the most disturbing sections of the series, not because of adult content alone, but because of how controlled and mechanical the experiences were described to be. 50 Cent says he included these stories not to shock people, but because these testimonies came from people who lived through it and wanted it recorded. The documentary also shows the Homeland Security raids, which became a turning point. Tactical teams at the gates, helicopters flying above, doors broken down, electronics removed, and Diddy's sons handcuffed as agents searched the home. 50 Cent posted the images online immediately, adding his usual comments. People joked that he must have been working with the feds because he reacted so fast, but 50 laughed it off. Still, the timing made people wonder. From there, the documentary goes back and forth between Diddy's past and present. It shows how he built a brand based on power, wealth, and charm. But it also shows how that same power created a circle around him where people felt they could not say no. The director says the documentary is not only about Diddy, but about the culture that protected him. She says it forces viewers to think about why the public worships celebrities and overlooks warning signs. As the documentary releases, Diddy responds through a spokesperson, calling it a hit piece made by someone who hates him. He says it twists the truth and tries to humiliate him while he is in prison. But 50 Cent continues to say he did not create the story. He only created the space for the story to be told. He says the footage speaks for itself, the testimonies speak for themselves, and the public can decide what they believe. The documentary ends with the message that this story is not finished. There are more interviews, more footage, and more people speaking every day. Diddy is still appealing his conviction. His businesses have collapsed. His reputation is damaged forever. And 50 Cent says he made this documentary because history needed a record of what happened. He says people needed to see how someone who had everything could lose it all, because the truth always comes out, no matter how long it takes.
And even though the documentary closes its final episode with a sense of resolution, the truth is that the story around Diddy is only getting louder. The ripple effects are still spreading across Hollywood, the music industry, politics, and even social media. More people are stepping forward every week, sharing details that were once whispered privately at industry dinners or backstage at award shows. And because the documentary has already created a space where people feel safer telling their stories, those whispers have now turned into full conversations that the world is paying attention to. One of the unexpected effects of the documentary is how it brought old industry wounds back to the surface. People who had been pushed out of the music world, people who had been discredited, and people who were laughed at when they tried to speak up years ago are suddenly being listened to. Their experiences, once brushed aside as jealousy or bitterness, now have context. For the first time, the timeline of Diddy's rise is being analyzed alongside the timeline of the people who claim they were hurt by him. And when those timelines are layered on top of each other, the patterns begin to look difficult to ignore. The documentary digs deeper into what many insiders describe as the machine, the network of executives, security teams, lawyers, publicists, and celebrities who knew pieces of what was going on but stayed silent. Some of them appear on camera, some with their faces blurred, explaining how the cycle worked. They say Diddy was protected because he made too much money for too many powerful people. They say that every time a story surfaced, it was buried quickly because the people around him cared more about maintaining the empire than facing the truth. This part of the series becomes almost bigger than Diddy himself. It becomes a study of what happens when fame is so massive that morality becomes optional. One of the former employees says something that sticks with viewers. He wasn't the only problem. The problem was everyone who made excuses for him. And that moment becomes one of the central messages of the documentary. Silence is what allowed everything to grow. As the story unfolds, we see how that silence started breaking long before Cassie's lawsuit, long before the raids, and long before 50 Cent stepped into the picture. The documentary shows archive clips of people like Gene Deal, Diddy's former bodyguard, who had been telling parts of the story for years but was ignored or mocked. It shows old interviews where celebrities hinted at strange experiences but were afraid to say more. It even shows paparazzi footage from the early 2000s where Diddy's behavior looked unpredictable, but the world laughed it off because he was at the top of the industry. 50 Cent makes it clear that his series is not about destroying a man. It is about showing what happens when a person becomes untouchable and how dangerous that can be. He says that if the documentary feels heavy or overwhelming, it's because the truth always feels heavier than the myth. And for decades, Diddy lived inside a myth of power, charisma, and invincibility. The series also explores how Diddy's public image fell apart in real time on social media. It shows how fans went from defending him to questioning him to abandoning him completely. It shows how younger generations who grew up on social media and who are used to seeing celebrities face consequences did not protect him the way older generations once did. For them, the footage from inside his home, the allegations from the 90s, and the testimonies from people like Cassie and Capricorn Clark were not shocking, they were confirmation of a long-delayed truth. By the final episode, the documentary becomes less about Diddy's crimes and more about what happens next. Legal experts explain that the charges he is appealing are only one part of a much larger investigation. They say that federal agencies rarely conduct raids of this scale unless they believe there are more layers to uncover. The series mentions sealed indictments, ongoing interviews with former employees, and financial documents that were recovered during the raids. At this point, the story shifts to the future, to what it means for the industry now that one of its biggest power players has fallen. Some insiders believe more names will come out, that Diddy was not acting alone, and that the culture around him encouraged others to behave the same way. Others believe he will eventually try to rebuild his legacy from prison, shaping a narrative that shows himself as a victim of the system. But the documentary makes one thing clear: the world will never see him the same way again. And in the final moments, 50 Cent appears on camera one last time. He does not joke. He does not troll. He simply says that the purpose of the series was to document a truth that people were afraid to speak for too long. He says that he grew up watching the industry chew people up and spit them out, but that this time the wrong person was protected for too long. He says that history needed a record, something that the next generation could look at and understand how power works in entertainment. He ends with a message that people are already quoting online. You can hide money, you can hide paperwork, you can hide files, but you can't hide the truth forever. And that is where the first season closes, with a quiet message that the story is still unfolding, that more voices are coming forward, and that the world is watching every move closely. For Diddy, this is no longer about rumors or headlines. This is about legacy, accountability, and a truth that has finally stepped out of the shadows.